He trusted the holy name Al-Fatah to guard his walls. Instead, the opener unbarred every gate, stripped 70,000 swords from trembling hands, and let the wolves in, until the city of peace reeked like a godless slaughterhouse. It was the year of our Lord 1258, and the sun that beat down upon the round city of Baghdad felt less like a celestial body and more like the unblinking eye of a jealous god staring into a hoard of stolen jewels. To walk the streets of the Abbasid capital was to walk through the very navel of the world, where the Tigris River flowed not merely with water, but with the ink of scholars and the sweat of a million subjugated souls. Here, the air hung heavy and stagnant, perfumed so thickly with musk, ambergris, and the rotting sweetness of overripe dates that a man could scarcely breathe without tasting the decadence on his tongue. At the heart of this swirling nebula of commerce and prayer sat the 37th Caliph, Al-Sim Billah, a man who had mistaken the height of his walls for the depth of his piety. He dwelled within the Golden Gate Palace, a structure so magnificent that it seemed an insult to the poverty of the dust outside, believing himself to be the shadow of God on earth, untouchable and eternal. But the shadow had grown long and thin, and the man casting it was blinded by the glitter of his own treasury. He spent his days in the cool, subterranean vaults where sunlight was forbidden, running his soft, uncalloused hands through heaps of dinars and dirhams, listening to the metallic whisper of coins sliding against one another, a sound he loved more than the call to prayer or the laughter of children. It was here, in the gloom of his avarice, that he would whisper the name Al-Fatah, the opener, over and over again like a fevered mantra. He did not invoke the name to ask for the opening of his heart to charity, nor to open the granaries to the starving poor who huddled in the mud-brick shadows of his great monuments. Nay, he beseeched the Almighty to open new veins of gold in the mountains, to open the caravans of the Silk Road to heavier taxes, to open the bellies of the earth so that he might consume more. He believed that because he held the keys to the temporal gates of the city, he also held the favor of the divine opener. The Caliph was a creature of such profound delusion that he had ceased to pay his own soldiers, believing that the spiritual weight of his lineage was a shield stronger than iron or mail. When his advisers, men with trembling hands and eyes wide with the foresight of doom, came to him whispering of the rumblings from the east, speaking of a darkness that moved across the steppes like a plague of locusts, Sim would merely smile a vacuous, silken smile. He would gesture to the walls, 50 feet high and thick as a carriage, and declare that the birds of the air would sooner fall dead than a barbarian boot would tread upon his mosaic floors. He did not see that by hoarding the wealth of the empire and closing his fist tight around every copper coin, he was inadvertently invoking the other aspect of Al-Fatah. For in his refusal to open his hand in generosity, he was forcing the universe to pry it open with violence. The city was a ripe fruit, bursting at the seams with juice and sugar, hanging low on a withered branch, waiting for the first strong wind to dash it against the hard, unforgiving ground. The silence of the palace was not peace, it was the holding of breath before a scream, and the Caliph, deafened by the clinking of his gold, could not hear the sharpening of the blades that were already thirsty for the wine of his veins. From the distant jagged horizons of the east, a sound began to bleed into the world, a low and rhythmic thrumming that was felt in the marrow of the bone long before it was heard by the ear. It was not the rumble of thunder, which speaks of the chaotic anger of the heavens, but rather the terrifying, synchronized pulse of the earth itself recoiling under the weight of a new and terrible master. This was the vibration of 200,000 horses, a moving continent of muscle and iron that drank the rivers dry and trampled the grass into a memory. Leading this living storm was Hulagu Khan, the grandson of the great Khan, a man whose heart was forged from the same freezing steel as his sword, and he did not come to knock upon the doors of Baghdad, he came to tear them from their hinges. The horde moved with the inevitability of a glacier and the speed of a wildfire, a paradox of destruction that defied the comprehension of the soft, silk-clad scholars trembling atop the city walls. They brought with them the smell of the steppes, a pungent, suffocating mixture of sour fermented mare's milk, unwashed wool, wood smoke, and the copper tang of dried blood that seemed to cling to their skin like a second layer of armor. As the Mongol army fanned out across the plains, surrounding the city of peace in a choking embrace, the sun itself seemed to dim, obscured by the dust of their passage and the smoke of the villages they had already incinerated on their march. They were not merely an army, they were a mobile instrument of apocalypse, bringing with them Chinese engineers who knew the dark alchemy of gunpowder and siegecraft, men who could coax stone and fire to fly through the air like birds of prey. The Caliph's soldiers, unpaid and demoralized, watched in paralyzed horror as the invaders began to fell the palm trees, stripping the land bare to construct great engines of war. Trebuchets arose from the dust like skeletal giants, their long wooden arms pointing accusatorily at the golden domes of the palace, casting long, splintered shadows over the terrified populace. The Tigris River, once the artery of life for the city, was now weaponized against it. The Mongols seized the dikes and manipulated the waters, creating a mire of mud and despair on the western banks, trapping the defenders in a sludge that sucked the boots from their feet and the hope from their souls. Inside the walls, the air grew thin and brittle, snapping with the tension of a million panicked breaths. The markets, usually a cacophony of haggling and joy, fell into a hush so profound that the scratching of a rat could be heard 3 streets away. The mosques overflowed with weeping men and wailing women, their foreheads pressed against the cool tiles until the skin broke, screaming the names of God into the void. They cried out to Al-Fattah to open a way out, to open the sky and rain down fire upon the heathen, but the opener was already at work in the most literal and terrifying of ways. He was opening the protective shell of their reality. The first stone that struck the Al-Ajami tower did not just shatter masonry, it shattered the illusion of invincibility that had shrouded the Abbasid Caliphate for 500 years. The crash was deafening, a thunderclap of man's making that sent dust billowing into the lungs of the faithful, choking them with the pulverized remains of their own history. Hulagu Khan sat in his tent of felt and gold, a predator waiting for the prey to bleed out, and watched the panic unfold with eyes as cold and indifferent as the stars. He sent no demands for surrender, for he knew that the time for words had turned to ash. He offered no terms, for one does not negotiate with the grass before the scythe swings. The psychological terror was as potent as the naphtha pots that his engineers began to hurl over the walls, jars of liquid fire that burst upon impact, splashing sticky, inextinguishable hellfire onto the flesh of the defenders. Men burned alive in their armor, their screams joining the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the catapults in a symphony of the damned. The Caliph al-Musta-sim, huddled in the deepest recess of his palace, found that his gold could not buy the wind, and his jewels could not bribe the stone that now rained from the sky. He had spent a lifetime praying for the opening of treasure chests, never realizing that the gates of a city, once closed to the suffering of the poor, could be opened from the outside by the wrath of the scorned. The siege was not merely a military encirclement, it was a tightening noose, a slow strangulation where every day brought less food, less water, and less sanity. The circle of iron outside the walls was complete, and the opener had turned the key, unlocking a chamber of horrors that the people of Baghdad could not yet fully comprehend, for the true sack had not even begun, and already the streets smelled of sulfur and fear. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's flensing knife, sliced through the bloated heart of the city, severing the last tendons of order that held the capital together. The streets of Baghdad, once the veins of the world's commerce, had become arteries of pure terror, clogged not with silk merchants and poets, but with a hysterical mass of humanity that flowed like a dark, frantic river toward the mosques. They flocked to the houses of God until the stone floors could no longer be seen beneath the sea of bodies, men and women pressing their foreheads into the dust in desperate, bruising prostration, their spines bent under the weight of an impending doom that felt as heavy as the sky itself. The air inside the sanctuaries grew thick and sour, depleted of oxygen and replaced by the recycled breath of the terrified, a miasma of sweat, tears, and the acrid smoke of 1,000 burning lamps lit in futile hope. From the minarets, the muezzins called out not with the melodious assurance of the faithful, but with voices that cracked and wavered, their cries to the heavens swallowed instantly by the roaring din of the Mongol war drums that beat a ceaseless, maddening rhythm outside the walls, a heartbeat of death that never slowed, never slept, and never showed mercy. Inside the Golden Gate Palace, the Caliph al-Musta-sim paced the marble floors of his private chambers, the soles of his soft slippers making no sound, a ghost haunting his own tomb. He was a man unraveling, his mind fracturing under the pressure of a reality he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He looked to his advisors, the vizier and the generals, but found only reflections of his own cowardice in their averted eyes. They were statues of wax melting before the furnace of the Khan's wrath. In a spasm of desperate delusion, the caliph sought to bargain with the apocalypse. He commanded his treasury to be opened, not to pay the soldiers who were dying upon the ramparts with empty bellies and rusted swords, but to bribe the beast that scratched at the door. He sent forth messengers, men whose faces were as pale as the parchment they carried, bearing gifts of such opulence that they would have bought entire kingdoms in a sane world, caravans of soft gold, trays of pearls dug from the deepest oysters of the Gulf, and robes of silk woven with threads of silver. He offered the Khan a tribute that would make an emperor weep, believing in his arrogance that the Mongols were merely bandits writ large, savages who could be satiated with shiny baubles and sent back to the darkness of the steppes. He prayed feverishly to Al-Fattah, the opener, beseeching the Almighty to open a path of negotiation, to open the heart of Hulagu Khan to greed so that he might be bought off like a common mercenary. But the caliph did not understand the nature of the wolf that stood at his gate. Hulagu did not want the gold, for in his mind, the gold was already his. Why bargain for what you can take? Why accept a gift from a hand you intend to sever? The messengers returned not with a treaty, but with the grim silence of the grave, their gifts untouched, a terrifying message that shouted louder than any words. The Mongols did not seek wealth, they sought the total annihilation of the Abbasid soul. The bombardment intensified, a reign of ruin that defied the laws of nature. The Mongol engineers, masters of a dark and terrible geometry, adjusted their great machines, and the stones that flew through the air grew larger, striking the walls with the force of a falling mountain. The sound of the impact was a physical blow to every soul in the city, a sickening crunch of masonry that vibrated through the teeth and bones of the inhabitants. Tower after tower began to crumble, the great stone ribs of Baghdad snapping one by one under the relentless assault. Clouds of lime and dust rose up to choke the sun, turning the day into a gray, ghostly twilight where men wandered like specters, covered in the white powder of their own destruction. It was in this choking fog that the true irony of the name Al-Fattah began to manifest with a cruel and divine precision. The caliph had prayed for openings, and now the opener answered him in a language of devastation. The walls, those ancient guardians that had stood for centuries, were being opened, breached by the relentless pounding of the trebuchets. Great gaps appeared in the fortifications, jagged wounds in the stone flesh of the city through which the defenders could see the endless sea of Mongol cavalry waiting, still as statues, their lances a forest of iron pointed at the throat of the world. Despair turned to madness within the besieged city. In the markets, where food had vanished days ago, men fought with bare hands over the carcass of a rat or a handful of dry grain, their dignity stripped away by the gnawing beast of hunger. Mothers smothered their infants to save them from the horror of the inevitable, their wails joining the cacophony of screeching metal and crumbling stone. The Tigris River, once the bringer of life, began to carry the first omens of the massacre to come, bodies of those who had tried to swim to freedom, now floating bloated and pierced by Mongol arrows, drifting downstream as silent warnings to those who remained. The caliph, watching from his high balcony, saw the smoke rising from the breach in the Al-Ajami tower and felt the cold hand of destiny grip his heart. He realized, with a nausea that nearly brought him to his knees, that his prayers had been inverted. He had asked for the gates of mercy to open, but instead, he had summoned the opening of the floodgates of calamity. The protective seal of the city was broken. The variant one of his existence, the life of luxury, of blindness, of thinking himself the untouchable shadow of God, was dissolving into smoke. He was no longer the master of the faithful, he was a trapped animal in a cage of gold, and the key was in the hand of a man who knew no God but the blue sky and the sword. The tension stretched to its breaking point, a bowstring pulled so tight it began to sing a high, keening note of death. There was no more time for prayer, no more time for bribes, no more time for the soft lies of courtiers. The walls were open. The enemy was at the threshold. And the caliph, trembling in his silks, knew that the only opening left to him was the one that led directly into the mouth of the abyss. Then came the day of the great folly, a day birthed not in the golden light of the morning sun but in the grey, suffocating pall of a truce that smelled of treachery and ash. It was the 10th day of the 2nd month in the year of our Lord 1258, and a silence more terrifying than the thunder of the catapults descended upon the city of peace. The great iron-throated engines of the Mongol horde ceased their rhythmic pounding, and the air, which had for weeks been a solid wall of noise and vibration, suddenly cleared, leaving a void that rang in the ears of the faithful like the tolling of a funeral bell. The Caliph al-Musta'sim, emerging from his subterranean vaults like a mole blinded by the dawn, mistook this cessation of violence for the hesitation of the enemy. In his fevered mind, warped by centuries of inherited arrogance and the whispering of false counselors, he believed that the sanctity of his blood had finally struck fear into the heart of the heathen Khan. He smoothed the silk of his robes, which were embroidered with verses of protection that would soon be stained with the muck of the stables, and convinced himself that the wolf of the East had come to heal. His vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a man whose heart was a nest of vipers and whose tongue dripped with the honey of deceit, urged him forward, whispering that Hulagu Khan sought only to gaze upon the face of the shadow of God and to receive his blessing in exchange for a peaceful departure. It was a lie so monstrous that it should have cracked the very pillars of the palace, yet the Caliph, desperate to believe that the world still operated according to his whims, drank it down like a draught of cool water in a desert of fire. And so, the order was given, a command that would echo through the corridors of history as the singular death knell of the Islamic Golden Age. The Caliph ordered the great gates of Baghdad, those timber and iron titans that had withstood the erosion of time and the ambition of lesser kings, to be unbarred. He did not see that in doing so, he was performing the final, perverse rite of Al-Fattah. He was opening that which should have remained eternally closed, unlocking the sanctuary of the sheep to the hunger of the wolves. The procession that marched out to meet the Mongol host was a spectacle of tragic absurdity. The Caliph, mounted on a white stallion whose mane was braided with threads of gold, was surrounded by 3,000 of his most elite nobles, scholars, and jurists, the very flower of Baghdad's intellect and aristocracy. They rode not with swords drawn and armor gleaming, but in their finest ceremonial garb, wearing turbans of blinding white and robes of damask and velvet, carrying nothing but their dignity and their delusion. They rode out of the darkness of the city archway and into the blinding glare of the Mesopotamian plain, blinking against the light, expecting to be met with the bowing heads of barbarians awed by their spiritual majesty. Instead, they rode into a silence so profound it felt like the pressure of deep water. The Mongol army was not a rabble of shouting savages as the Caliph had imagined, it was a machine of perfect, terrifying discipline. Tens of thousands of warriors sat atop their shaggy ponies, motionless as statues carved from granite, their leather armor creaking softly in the wind, their faces hidden behind masks of iron or the grim grime of war. There were no jeers, no taunts, no chaotic movements, only thousands of pairs of eyes, black and unblinking, tracking the progress of the soft, perfumed men who rode toward them. It was the gaze of a predator that knows the chase is over and the feeding is about to begin. Hulagu Khan sat upon a throne raised on a dais of beaten earth, surrounded by his generals and the shamans who read the future in the cracks of burnt shoulder blades. He did not rise. He did not bow. He merely watched, his face a mask of impassive cruelty, as the Caliph dismounted and walked the final yards across the dusty ground, his golden slippers sinking into the earth that was already thirsty for his blood. When al-Musta'sim stood before the Khan, he expected a negotiation, a parley between equals. What he found was a judgment. The Khan spoke, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together in a riverbed, and his words were not of peace, but of dismantling. He demanded that the Caliph order his soldiers to lay down their arms. He demanded that the defenders vacate the walls and march out to be counted. He demanded that the entire populace of the city be disarmed, claiming that only a city without claws could be embraced as a friend. The Caliph, trembling now as the cold reality of his position began to pierce the veil of his vanity, hesitated. But he looked back at the city, at the smoke rising from the breaches, and then at the endless ocean of iron-clad horsemen surrounding him, and he realized he had no cards left to play. He turned to his messengers and gave the fatal command. Back in the city, the defenders, weary and confused, heard the order from their commander of the faithful. They looked at their swords, the edges chipped from weeks of desperate combat, and they looked at the open gates where their caliph stood unharmed. With heavy hearts and tears of frustration carving tracks through the dust on their faces, they threw down their spears. They unbuckled their scabbards. They walked away from the ramparts that had been their home and their fortress. The sound of 70,000 swords hitting the ground was not a clatter, it was the sound of a civilization breaking its own spine. The gates were flung wide, not just the main gate, but every gate, every postern, every sally port. The city was stripped naked, its protective shell discarded at the behest of the one man sworn to keep it intact. And then, the movement began. It was not a sudden rush, for the Mongols were patient butchers. It was a slow, sinister infiltration. Squadrons of Mongol warriors began to ride through the open gates, their horses' hooves clacking loudly on the cobblestones of the entryways. They rode in single file at first, expressionless, ignoring the terrified citizens who lined the streets to watch them pass. They rode past the great madrasas, past the House of Wisdom, past the bazaars that still smelled of spices and fear. The people of Baghdad watched with bated breath, praying that this was merely an occupation, a change of management, a heavy tax to be paid and then life would resume. They did not see the subtle signals passing between the Mongol commanders. They did not see the way the warriors were positioning themselves at every intersection, every square, every strategic choke point of the metropolis. They were the virus entering the bloodstream, disseminating through the body of the host before the fever finally struck. Al-Musta-Sim, held now not as a guest but as a captive in the Khan's tent, watched through the open flap as his city was penetrated. He saw the banners of the Golden Horde rising above his own walls. He saw his soldiers, now unarmed and helpless, being herded into groups outside the city, told they were to be processed for amnesty. He watched as they were marched into the ditches and the hollows of the landscape, out of sight of the walls. It was only when the wind shifted, carrying the sound of sudden, rhythmic thuds and the wet, gargling screams of thousands of men dying simultaneously, that the caliph truly understood the transaction he had made. He had traded his honor for a promise written on water. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Al-Fattah had indeed opened the way. The opener had unlocked the gates, but he had also unlocked the cage of a beast that had no concept of mercy. The caliph had opened the door to the wind, and now he was shocked that the storm had followed him inside. The sun began to set on the 10th day, casting long, blood-red shadows across the domes of Baghdad, and as the light failed, the first fires began to flicker in the streets, not the fires of hearths, but the fires of torches held by men who had been given permission to do the unthinkable. The tension that had held the city in its grip for weeks did not break, it shattered into a million shards of horror. The wolves were not just at the door, they were in the parlor, they were in the nursery, they were in the sanctuary, and they were hungry. The sack of the city of peace did not begin as a sudden explosion of violence, but rather as a terrifyingly systematic dismantling of humanity, a cold and industrial butchery that unfolded with the precision of a clockmaker dissecting a timekeeper to see what made it tick. It was the 13th day of the second month in the year of our Lord 1258, a day when the sun rose pale and sickly behind a veil of smoke that had already begun to choke the horizon, casting a jaundiced light over streets that were about to be washed in the darkest crimson. Hulagu Khan had given the signal, a simple lowering of a hand, a nod of a head, and with that small gesture, the leash was cut, and the hounds of hell were loosed upon the fold. The Mongol horde, those warriors born of the wind and the harsh grass, did not run through the streets screaming like common bandits. They moved with a grim, silent purpose, sweeping through the districts of Baghdad like a scythe through ripe wheat. They were the agents of a new and terrible entropy, and their mission was not merely to conquer, but to erase. The first district to fall was the Kark, the bustling western quarter, where the merchants and the artisans dwelled. The people there, huddled in their homes with doors barred and prayers trembling on their lips, heard the boots on the pavement first, a rhythmic thudding that grew louder and louder until it was replaced by the splintering of wood and the shattering of iron. The doors were not opened, they were smashed inward, reduced to kindling, and the sanctity of the home was violated by men who smelled of horse sweat and dried gore. The slaughter that followed was of a magnitude that the human mind struggles to encompass, a horror so vast it defies the geometry of compassion. The sword did not discriminate between the neck of the emir and the neck of the beggar, it knew no difference between the silk-clad bosom of the noblewoman and the rough tunic of the water-carrier. Men were dragged from their hiding places in cellars and attics, their pleas for mercy cut short by the swift, wet draw of a blade across the throat. Women were torn from the arms of their husbands, children from the breasts of their mothers, and the air was filled with a cacophony of screams that rose up to the heavens in a solid, vibrating column of anguish. But the heavens, it seemed, had turned their back, or perhaps the smoke was too thick for the prayers to penetrate. The streets, those ancient thoroughfares that had once rung with the debates of philosophers and the songs of poets, began to slick over with a terrible viscosity. Blood did not merely spill, it pooled, it flowed, it sought the lowest ground, turning the gutters into rushing rivulets of red that mirrored the madness above. The Mongols moved from house to house, street to street, leaving nothing behind but silence and corpses. They were thorough in their grim work, pausing only to wipe their blades or to pile the heads of the slain into pyramids that stood as grotesque monuments to their victory, stark geometric reminders of the fragility of life. But the sack of Baghdad was not merely a massacre of the flesh, it was an assassination of the mind, a deliberate decapitation of human history. The greatest tragedy, the wound that would fester in the soul of the world for 1,000 years, took place not in the barracks or the bazaars, but in the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age, a library that rivaled the lost vaults of Alexandria, a sanctuary where the knowledge of the Greeks, the Persians, the Indians, and the Arabs had been gathered, translated, and cherished. Here lay the works of Aristotle and Plato, the medical treatises of Galen and Hippocrates, the astronomical charts that mapped the dance of the stars, and the mathematical theorems that defined the logic of the universe. The Mongols, men of the saddle and the bow who held the written word in suspicious contempt, looked upon this treasure trove not with awe, but with the disdain of the barbarian for the civilized. To them, these millions of books were not vessels of wisdom, they were fuel. They were useless clutter. They stormed the great halls of the library, their boots tramping over mosaics that depicted the constellations, and they began the great unmaking. Scholars, white-bearded men who had spent their lives hunched over parchment, were cut down amidst their life's work, their blood spraying across the pages of manuscripts they had just finished translating. The ink of their veins mixed with the ink of their pens, a tragic confluence of life and art. And then, the looting of the mind began. The Mongols took the books, leather-bound volumes tooled with gold, scrolls of ancient papyrus, codices illuminated with lapis lazuli and vermilion, and they carried them to the banks of the Tigris River. They did not read them. They did not steal them. They simply threw them away. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, the collective memory of humanity, were cast into the water. It was an act of cultural suicide forced upon a civilization at the point of a sword. The heavy volumes splashed into the current, sinking into the muck, their pages dissolving, their wisdom liquefying. The river, which had flowed clear and brown for eons, began to change color. It turned a bruised, swirling black, dyed by the ink of a million drowned words. It was said by those who watched from the far banks, weeping until their eyes ran dry, that the Tigris ran black with ink and red with blood, a bicolored ribbon of destruction that carried the soul of Baghdad down toward the sea. The devastation extended to the spiritual architecture of the city as well. The great mosque of Al-Mansur, a marvel of brick and faith, was set ablaze. The fire roared through the prayer hall, consuming the intricate wooden minbar, melting the gold lamps, and cracking the tiles that had cooled the foreheads of the faithful for centuries. The smoke from the burning city rose so high and so thick that it blocked out the sun completely, plunging the region into an artificial twilight at noon. In this gloom, the fires raged like living things, feeding on the cedar beams of the palaces, the tapestries of the harems, and the bodies of the fallen. The smell was a physical assault, a cloying, suffocating stench of roasting meat, burning hair, scorched paper, and the copper tang of spilled life. It was the scent of the end of the world. The sounds of the city dying were distinct and horrifying, the crackle of flames, the crash of collapsing domes, the wailing of the survivors being herded into slavery, and the triumphant, guttural shouts of the victors. The Mongols, in their frenzy, seemed to be trying to erase the very concept of the city, to turn the complex, vertical grandeur of urbanization back into the flat, empty horizontal of the steppe. They tore down walls not to breach them, but to level them. They filled in canals. They uprooted gardens that had been tended for generations, trampling the roses and the jasmine into the bloody mud. In the midst of this apocalypse, the irony of the name Al-Fattah, the opener, reached its most horrific crescendo. Every hiding place was opened. Every secret vault was cracked. Every sanctuary was violated. The belly of the city was sliced open and its entrails spilled out for the vultures, which began to circle in the thousands, darkening the sky further with their ragged wings. The Mongols were the surgeons of this opening, dissecting the corpse of the caliphate with a ruthlessness that suggested they were punishing the city for the crime of existing, for the sin of accumulation, for the arrogance of thinking that stone walls could keep out the wind. The Tigris became a bridge of the dead, so many bodies were cast into the water that one could, it was rumored, walk across the river on a pontoon of corpses without wetting one's feet. Philosophers floated alongside thieves, princes alongside paupers, all united in the democracy of death, their swollen bodies bumping against the dissolving books, a grotesque slurry of flesh and knowledge flowing downstream. For 7 days and 7 nights, the sack continued. The killing did not stop for sleep. The Mongols rotated their warriors, fresh butchers relieving the tired ones, ensuring that the harvest of death never ceased. The population of Baghdad, which had numbered nearly 1 million souls, was winnowed down like chaff in a gale. 800,000, perhaps 1 million, the numbers lost all meaning, becoming mere abstractions in the face of the mountains of skulls that began to rise at the city gates. These pyramids of bone were the only new structures built in Baghdad that week, monuments to the efficiency of the Mongol war machine. The silence that eventually fell over the city was not the silence of peace, but the silence of the void. It was the silence of a library where all the books have been burned, the silence of a nursery where all the children have been slain, the silence of a throat that has been cut. The city of peace had become a city of ghosts, a smoldering ruin where the only movement was the drifting smoke and the feral dogs fighting over scraps of what used to be men. And through it all, the Tigris flowed on, black and red, carrying the story of the tragedy away from the ruins, a story written in the fluids of a dying civilization, forcing the world to drink the bitter draught of a history that had been irrevocably, violently opened. As the smoke of the burning city curled into the heavens like the blackened prayers of the damned, the fate of the 37th Abbasid Caliph, Al-Musta-Sim Billah, drew to its terrifying and claustrophobic conclusion. He was not granted the mercy of a swift beheading, nor the dignity of a warrior's death upon the field of battle. Such endings are for men who stand, not for men who kneel. Instead, he was kept for a time in a state of grotesque purgatory, a prisoner within his own plundered vaults. It is said that Hulagu Khan, observing the Caliph's distress and hunger, ordered that he be shut up in the royal treasury, surrounded by the towering heaps of dinars, the mountains of emeralds, and the rivers of pearls that he had hoarded with such miserly zeal. There, in the glittering silence of his avarice, the Khan sent him a final meal, a platter of heavy gold nuggets and a goblet filled with loose diamonds. When the Caliph, weeping with the gnawing pain of starvation, protested that he could not eat metal and stone, the Khan merely stared with the cold logic of the steppe, a silent rebuke that echoed louder than thunder. If he had but scattered this gold to his soldiers, he might have eaten bread today. If he had opened his hand to the wind, he might not now be choking on his own harvest. The Caliph sat amidst the sterile, cold wealth that could not sustain a single beat of his heart, realizing too late that gold is but yellow earth, and value is a phantom of the mind. He was the richest man in the world, and yet he was the poorest, for he possessed everything except the right to draw another breath in peace. But the final act of this tragedy required a specific and ritualistic brutality, for the Mongols were a people bound by the laws of the blue sky, the Tungri. Their shamans whispered that the blood of a king was sacred, not in the sense of holiness, but in the sense of taboo. to spill royal blood upon the earth was to offend the spirits of the land and the sky, to invite disaster upon the victor. The earth must not taste the caliph's life, the sun must not see his veins opened. And so, a method of execution was devised that was as innovative as it was horrific, a death that would contain the royal essence while extinguishing the royal spark. On the 20th day of the second month in the year of 1258, Al-Mustassim was dragged from his confinement, his robes of state now tattered and stained with the filth of his captivity. He was brought to a flat stretch of ground outside the city walls, where the mud had been churned into a paste by the hooves of the conquering army. There, waiting for him, was not a block and axe, but a magnificent carpet, one of his own, woven by the master artisans of Persia, a tapestry of intricate geometric beauty, threaded with silk and dyed with the rarest indigo and saffron. It was a masterpiece of the civilization he represented, a symbol of the comfort and the artistry of Baghdad. The caliph, trembling so violently that his teeth rattled in his skull like dice in a cup, was cast down upon the wool. He was not permitted to pray, he was not permitted to speak. Rough hands, callous and strong, seized him and began to roll. The world, with its grey sky and its burning horizon, began to rotate and vanish. He was wrapped tightly, layer upon layer of heavy wool enclosing him, pinning his arms to his sides, binding his legs together, pressing his face into the dark, stifling scratchiness of the fabric. The light of the sun was snuffed out, replaced by the suffocating blackness of the weave. He was no longer a man, he was a bundle, a cylindrical prison of his own luxury. The irony was absolute, he who had wrapped himself in the insulation of wealth, who had cocooned himself against the harsh realities of the world, was now literally entombed within the trappings of his station. He could scream, but the wool drank his voice, turning his cries into muffled, pathetic bleats that traveled no further than the thickness of the rug. He was alone in the dark, trapped in a heated, airless void, smelling the dust of the carpet and the sour terror of his own sweat. Then came the sound. At first, it was a dull vibration felt through the ground, transmitted through the wool to his cheek. Then it grew to a rhythmic thundering, the heavy, unmistakable cadence of galloping horses. The Mongol cavalry, their ponies shod with iron, began their run. This was not a charge of war, but a trample of execution. The first hoof struck the carpet with the force of a hammer. The caliph felt the sudden, shocking impact, the cracking of a rib, the air forced from his lungs in a sharp, agonizing burst. He gasped for breath in the fibrous darkness, but there was no air to be had, only dust. Then came another, and another. The horses were driven over the carpet again and again, their hooves pounding the bundle into the mud. The pain was a kaleidoscope of shattering bone and crushing pressure, a dismantling of the human form within a soft casing. Every bone that had sat upon the throne was ground to powder, every organ that had swelled with pride was ruptured. The Caliph Al-Mustassim, the shadow of God on earth, was flattened into the dirt, kneaded like dough under the relentless, indifferent stride of the beast. In that final, agonizing darkness, as his consciousness flickered and faded under the weight of the trampling herd, one must wonder if the name Al-Fattah flashed through his dying mind one last time. He had spent his life praying to the opener to unlock the doors of treasury and tribute. He had believed that the opener served him. But in the end, the opener had closed everything. The gates of the city were open, yes, but the gates of his life were slammed shut. The earth did not open to swallow him, instead, he was pressed onto it, denied even the sanctuary of a grave, denied the spilling of his blood, denied the release of the open air. He died in the most absolute containment imaginable, crushed within the very symbol of his status. The Mongols rode until the bundle ceased to move, until the shape within was no longer recognizable as human. Then, they rode on. They left the carpet there, a flat, sodden mass in the mud, a tomb that required no masonry, a grave that bore no marker. The wind from the steppes blew over the ruins of Baghdad, scattering the ashes of the House of Wisdom, carrying the scent of death down the Tigris to the sea. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had stood for 500 years as a beacon of light in a darkening world, was extinguished not with a bang, but with the dull thud of hooves on wool. The golden age was over, trampled into the mire. And silence, deep and terrible, reclaimed the city of peace. The opener had finished his work. The book was closed. The story was done.